When Marlena Fairchild failed to produce an heir after 4 years of marriage, her wealthy rancher husband didn't just cast her out, he buried her alive in the scorching Wyoming desert as punishment from God, leaving only her head above ground for the vultures to find. What he didn't expect was White Feather, a half Cheyenne tracker with his own tragic past, to hear her screams echoing across the canyon and risk everything to claw through 6 feet of earth with his bare hands to save a woman he'd never met.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun in 1887, its golden grasslands shimmering like waves of heat that could drive a man mad if he stared too long. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust across the rolling hills, broken only by the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above the barren landscape. In this unforgiving land, where survival meant everything and weakness meant death, the most dangerous predators weren't the wolves or the bears. They were the men who believed God spoke through their fists. Marlena Fairchild had learned this brutal truth 4 years ago when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Ridge, Wyoming, wearing her finest emerald dress and carrying her grandmother's silver locket, believing she was about to begin a fairy tale. Marriage to one of the territory's most successful cattle barons. What she found instead was a nightmare that would end with her gasping for breath through 6 feet of earth, her lips cracked and bleeding, her voice hoarse from screaming into the endless Wyoming sky, but to understand how a woman who once danced at Philadelphia society balls came to be buried alive in the middle of nowhere. We must go back to the beginning, to the day she first met Josiah Blackthorne. Josiah Blackthorne was not a man who believed in subtlety. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive suits, and steel gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, he commanded attention wherever he went. His black hair was always perfectly groomed, his mustache waxed to sharp points, and his boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the Colorado sunlight when he'd arrived in Philadelphia. During the spring of 1883, he'd come to the city on business, or so he claimed, but his real purpose was far more calculating. At 35, Josiah had built an empire in the Wyoming Territory, 40,000 acres of prime grazing land, 3,000 head of cattle, and a sprawling ranch house that could house a small army. What he didn't have was a wife, and more importantly, what he desperately needed was an heir to secure his legacy and satisfy the territorial laws that favored married landowners. Marlena Fairchild was 19 when she first saw him at the Autumn Harvest Ball, hosted by her father's business associates in Philadelphia's most exclusive district. She was the daughter of a successful textile merchant, well-educated and refined, with striking auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond her sheltered existence. Josiah had done his research. He knew the Fairchild family had fallen on hard times, that her father's business was struggling, and that Marlena's prospects for marriage within their social circle were limited by their declining fortune. She was beautiful, well-bred, and most importantly, desperate enough to consider an offer that might otherwise seem too good to be true. Their courtship was a masterpiece of manipulation. Josiah showered her with expensive gift silk ribbons from San Francisco, a pearl bracelet from New Orleans, books of poetry bound in Moroccan leather. He told her stories of the West that made it sound like a land of endless opportunity and adventure, where a woman could breathe freely under vast open skies instead of suffocating in the smoke-choked streets of Philadelphia. Out there, he would say, taking her hand as they strolled through Rittenhouse Square, a woman can be anything she wants to be. There are no rules except the ones you make for yourself. What he didn't tell her was that on his ranch, there was only one rule that mattered. His word was law. The proposal came after just 6 weeks of courtship, delivered on one knee in her father's study with a diamond ring that cost more than most men made in a year. Marlena's father, drowning in debt and desperate for a way to save his business, practically pushed her into Josiah's arms. The wedding was arranged for the following spring, giving Josiah time to return to Wyoming and prepare for his bride's arrival. During those months of separation, Josiah's letters painted a picture of romantic bliss. He described the house he was building for her, a grand Victorian mansion with gingerbread trim and stained glass windows that would rival anything in Philadelphia. He wrote of servants who would attend to her every need, of gardens where she could grow roses and jasmine, of evenings spent on the wraparound porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. What he was actually preparing was a prison. The train journey from Philadelphia to Wyoming took 5 days. 5 days during which Marlena pressed her face to the window and watched the civilized world gradually give way to something wild and untamed. The closer they got to Copper Ridge, the more her excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. The landscape became increasingly desolate, the town smaller and rougher, the people harder and more weathered. When the train finally pulled into the station at Copper Ridge, Marlena was struck by how different everything looked from Josiah's descriptions. The town was little more than a collection of rough wooden buildings and dusty streets, with a saloon that seemed to be doing more business than the church, and more horses tied to hitching posts than she'd ever seen in one place. Josiah was waiting for her on the platform, looking every inch the successful rancher in his leather vest and silver-studded belt. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in Philadelphia, a coldness that made her shiver despite the warm May afternoon. "Welcome home, my dear," he said, kissing her hand with lips that felt like ice. "I hope you're ready for a different kind of life." The ride to the ranch took 3 hours through country so wild and beautiful it took her breath away, but also so empty and isolated that she began to understand just how far she was from everything she'd ever known. When they finally arrived at the Blackthorn Ranch, Marlena's heart sank. The grand Victorian mansion from Josiah's letters was actually a large but stark wooden house with none of the elegant details he'd described. The gardens were patches of struggling vegetables and a few scraggly flowers fighting against the harsh Wyoming wind. "It's different from your letters," she said carefully, not wanting to offend him on their first day together. "Letters can be deceiving," Josiah replied, and she caught something in his tone that made her skin crawl. "Out here, we deal with reality, not fairy tales." The wedding ceremony was held the next morning in the small church in Copper Ridge, with only a handful of local ranchers and their wives in attendance. Marlena wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and tried to smile as the preacher spoke about wifely duties and obedience. But as Josiah slipped the ring onto her finger, she noticed his hands were shaking, not with emotion, but with something that looked suspiciously like barely contained rage. The first month of marriage was a careful dance of pretense. Josiah was polite but distant, treating Marlena more like a houseguest than a wife. He showed her around the ranch, introduced her to the handful of Mexican workers who tended the cattle, and explained the daily routines that kept the operation running. But there was always something watching in his eyes, as if he were waiting for her to fail some test she didn't know she was taking. The house was comfortable but cold, furnished with expensive pieces that had been shipped from Denver, but arranged without any thought for warmth or personality. Marlena tried to make it feel like home, rearranging furniture and adding touches of color with fabric and flowers. But Josiah would often come home to find her changes, and silently move everything back to its original position without saying a word. "I prefer things a certain way," he would say when she asked about it. "Order is important in a place like this." The first real crack in their facade of domestic bliss came when Marlena suggested they host a dinner party for some of the neighboring ranchers. She'd met several of their wives in town and thought it would be nice to build friendships in their new community.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Absolutely not, Josiah said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. We don't need their prying eyes in our business. But Josiah, we're part of this community now. Shouldn't we? You're my wife, he interrupted, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped against the wooden floor. Your job is to take care of this house and me, not to go gallivanting around making friends with every rancher's wife in the county. It was the first time she'd seen the mask slip, the first glimpse of the man who had been hiding behind the polite exterior. Marlena felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind rattling the windows. I just thought it would be nice to have some companionship, she said quietly. You have me, Josiah replied, but the way he said it made it sound more like a threat than a comfort. That should be enough. From that night forward, things began to change. Josiah started making rules, spoken and unspoken, that gradually tightened around Marlena like a noose. She wasn't to go to town without his permission. She wasn't to speak to the ranch hands beyond basic pleasantries. She wasn't to receive mail without him reading it first. And most importantly, she wasn't to question his decisions or authority in any way. As the months passed, Marlena began to realize that she hadn't married a man, she'd married a tyrant. Josiah's control extended to every aspect of her life, from what she wore to what she ate to how she spent her time. He would fly into rages over the smallest things, a plate left unwashed, a book left open on the table, a window left unlocked at night. A woman's place is in service to her husband, he would say during his calmer moments, as if he were explaining something perfectly reasonable. The Bible is clear on this point. Wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. But it was during the violent moments that Marlena truly understood the depth of her predicament. The first time he struck her, it was over a burnt pot roast that she'd left too long in the oven while tending to a sick calf that had wandered into their yard. The blow came so suddenly and with such force that she found herself on the kitchen floor, her cheek throbbing and her vision blurred. Don't you ever embarrass me like that again, he said, standing over her with his fist still clenched. A man's reputation is built on his wife's competence. She wanted to run, but where could she go? Philadelphia was 2,000 miles away, and she had no money of her own. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and she had no idea if they would help her or simply send her back to Josiah. In the Wyoming Territory, a woman's word meant nothing against her husband's, and domestic disputes were considered private matters to be handled within the family. So she stayed, and she learned to walk on eggshells, to anticipate his moods, to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. But the worst part wasn't the violence or the isolation, it was the growing realization that Josiah had never wanted a wife at all. He'd wanted a broodmare, and as the months passed without any sign of pregnancy, his frustration and anger grew. More dangerous. By the end of their first year of marriage, Josiah's obsession with producing an heir had become the driving force of his existence. He would time their intimate moments with the precision of a cattleman planning breeding schedules. And each month that passed without pregnancy was treated as a personal failure on Marlena's part. Every other woman in this territory manages to fulfill her basic function. He would snarl when her monthly cycle arrived like clockwork. What's wrong with you? Marlena had begun to suspect that the problem might not be with her. She'd grown up around horses and cattle, and she understood the basics of animal husbandry well enough to know that fertility issues could come from either party. But suggesting such a thing to Josiah would have been tantamount to signing her own death warrant. Instead, she endured his increasingly violent outbursts, his accusations that she was deliberately preventing conception, and his threats to send her back to Philadelphia in disgrace. As the second year of their marriage began, Josiah started consulting with the local preacher. a fire and brimstone man named Reverend Matthias Kane, who believed that barren women were cursed by God. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," Reverend Kane would intone during his weekly visits to the ranch. But when he withholds his blessing, it's because of sin. These sessions became a weekly torture for Marlena, with both men interrogating her about her faith, her prayers, her secret sins that might be preventing God from blessing their union. They made her kneel on the hard wooden floor of their parlor for hours at a time, praying for forgiveness for sins she couldn't name, begging God to make her worthy of motherhood. Perhaps, Reverend Kane suggested during one particularly brutal session, "The Lord is testing your faith." Sometimes he requires sacrifice before he grants his gifts. The suggestion planted a seed in Josea's mind that would eventually grow into something monstrous. The 3rd year of their marriage was when things truly began to unravel. Josiah's violence escalated from occasional outbursts to regular beatings, always careful to avoid marking her face or arms where others might see the evidence. He began to talk openly about replacing her, about finding a woman who could fulfill her duties as a wife and mother. "I should have chosen one of the Mexican girls," he would say during dinner, as if she weren't sitting right across from him. "At least they understand what's expected of them." Marlena had become a shadow of her former self, her weight dropping to dangerous levels, her once bright eyes now dull and hollow. She'd given up trying to maintain her appearance or take pride in her surroundings. The house had become as cold and lifeless as the marriage itself. It was during the 4th year that Josiah made his final decision. After another monthly disappointment, he called for Reverend Kane and 3 of the most prominent ranchers in the area, men who shared his beliefs about women's roles and divine punishment. "I've been patient," he announced to the gathered men as Marlena stood trembling in the corner of the parlor. "I've provided for her, protected her, given her every opportunity to fulfill her purpose, but she has failed in the most basic duty of a wife." "What do you propose?" asked Samuel Garrett, the owner of the neighboring spread. Josiah's eyes glittered with a madness that made Marlena's blood run cold. "The old ways, the biblical ways. If she cannot bring life into this world, then perhaps she needs to understand what it means to face death." The men murmured their agreement, caught up in Josiah's twisted logic and religious fervor. They spoke of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of God's requirement for absolute obedience, of the need to purge sin from their community. "It's a test," Reverend Kane declared. "If God means for her to live, he will provide a miracle. If not, then his will be done." That night, Marlena tried to run. She waited until Josiah was asleep, then crept from the house with nothing but the clothes on her back and her grandmother's silver locket. But the Wyoming territory was vast and unforgiving, and she was on foot in territory she barely knew. By dawn, Josiah and his men had tracked her down like a wild animal. "You've made your choice," he said as they dragged her back to the ranch. "Now you'll face the consequences." The ritual took place on a barren hilltop 5 miles from the ranch house, a place where the wind howled constantly and nothing grew but scrub brush and weeds. Josiah had chosen the spot carefully, far enough from the house that no one would hear her screams, but close enough that he could return to check on her progress. The 5 men worked in silence, digging a hole in the hard-packed earth that was just wide enough for her body and deep enough that only her head would remain above ground. As they worked, Reverend Kane read passages from the Bible about divine punishment and the wages of sin, his voice rising and falling with the wind. Marlena had stopped begging. She'd tried pleading, crying, reasoning, but nothing had penetrated their certainty that they were doing God's work. Now she simply stood there, her hands bound behind her back, watching them prepare her grave with a strange sense of detachment. "This is your last chance," Josiah said as the hole reached the proper depth. "Confess your sins, beg God's forgiveness, and perhaps he will show mercy." But Marlena had nothing left to confess. She'd been a faithful wife, a devoted daughter, a woman who'd tried to make the best of an impossible situation. If God required her death to satisfy these men's twisted interpretation of his will, then perhaps he wasn't the God she'd been raised to worship. "I have nothing to confess," she said, her voice barely a whisper but carrying clearly in the still air. "My only sin was trusting you." The words seemed to enrage Josiah more than any act of defiance could have. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her so violently that her teeth rattled in her skull. "You stubborn, faithless woman," he roared. "Even now, facing divine judgment, you refuse to submit." They forced her into the hole, packing the earth around her body until only her head remained visible. The sensation was horrible, claustrophobic, and terrifying, but Marlena forced herself to remain calm. If she was going to die, she would die with dignity. "We'll return tomorrow," Josiah said, looking down at her with something that might have been regret if she hadn't known him better. "If God means for you to live, he'll send rain to soften the earth, or perhaps a passing traveler to dig you free. If not," he shrugged, "his will be done." As the men mounted their horses and rode away, Marlena was left alone with the vast Wyoming sky and the growing realization that she was probably going to die in this godforsaken place. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the autumn leaves in Philadelphia. She thought of her mother, who had died when Marlena was 16, and wondered if she would see her again. Soon, she thought of her father, who had sold her into this marriage for the promise of financial security, and felt more pity than anger. She thought of all the things she would never do, the children she would never have, the life she would never live. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Marlena made a decision. She would not die quietly. She would not go gently into that good night. If God truly was watching, then he would hear her voice raised in defiance of the men who claimed to speak for him. And so she began to scream. Her voice echoed across the empty landscape, a sound of pure anguish and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. She screamed until her throat was raw, until her voice cracked and broke, until she had no breath left in her lungs. Then she would rest for a moment, gathering her strength, and scream again. She screamed for every woman who had ever been buried alive by men who claimed to love them. She screamed for every wife who had been beaten into submission, every daughter who had been sold into marriage, every mother who had died bringing life into the world only to have that life claimed by men's violence. And somewhere in the distance, a half Cheyenne tracker named White Feather heard her screams and turned his horse toward the sound, not knowing that he was about to become part of a story that would be told around campfires for generations to come. White Feather had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 days across the harsh Wyoming wilderness when the screaming started. At first, he thought it was just another coyote mourning its dead, but as he reined in his painted stallion and tilted his head to listen, the sound that carried on the wind was unmistakably human and unmistakably female. The half Cheyenne tracker was a man who had learned to read the land like other men read books. Every broken twig, every disturbed stone, every shift in the wind told him a story. But this sound cutting through the evening air was unlike anything he'd encountered in his 32 years of life, and that was saying something for a man who had witnessed the massacre at Wounded Knee and survived 3 winters alone in the mountains after his Cheyenne mother died of smallpox. His weathered hands tightened on the reins as he tried to determine the direction of the screams. They seemed to be coming from the northwest, toward the Badlands where nothing grew but bitter sage and the bones of dead animals. It was not a place where any sane person would venture, especially not a woman, but the voice was definitely female and filled with a desperation that made his chest tighten with memories he'd tried to bury. White Feather had been born Joseph Whitman to a Cheyenne mother named Singing Bird, and a cavalry officer father who'd abandoned them, both when the boy was barely old enough to walk. His mother had raised him in the traditional ways, teaching him to hunt and track and read the signs that the earth left for those wise enough to see them. But when the soldiers came to relocate the tribe to the reservation, everything changed. He'd watched his mother die slowly on that godforsaken strip of land they called home, her spirit broken by the loss of the mountains and prairies where she'd been born. After her death, he'd taken his father's name and tried to live in the white world, but he'd never quite fit in either place. Too Indian for the whites, too white for the Indians. He'd become a drifter, hiring out his tracking skills to whoever would pay him and trying to forget the sound of his mother's voice singing the old songs. But now, listening to those screams echoing across the wasteland, he was transported back to that terrible day when he'd found his mother's body, and he knew with absolute certainty that he could not ignore this cry for help, no matter how dangerous it might be to get involved. The screaming stopped abruptly, and White Feather felt his heart skip a beat. Either the woman had given up, or something had happened to silence her. Either way, he needed to find her, and fast. He spurred his horse toward the sound, his keen eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement or disturbance. The sun was setting rapidly, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and he knew that once full darkness fell, his chances of finding her would drop to almost nothing. As he rode, White Feather's mind raced through the possibilities. What was a woman doing out here alone? The nearest ranch was at least 15 miles away, and the nearest town was even farther. Had she been attacked by bandits? Had her horse thrown her? Had she gotten lost and wandered into the Badlands by mistake? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something was very wrong about this situation. Women didn't just end up screaming in the middle of nowhere without a very good reason, and that reason was usually man-made trouble of the worst kind. He'd been riding for about 20 minutes when he spotted the first sign hoofprints in the Kufkas. Dust, multiple horses, all heading in the same direction as the screams. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the last few hours, and White Feather could tell from the depth and spacing that the horses had been carrying riders, not just wandering loose. His jaw tightened as he followed the trail. Multiple riders heading toward the source of a woman's screams was never a good sign, especially not in territory where the law was whatever the man with the biggest gun said it was. The trail led him up a rocky slope toward a barren hilltop that looked like the kind of place where bad things happened and stayed buried. As he climbed higher, the screaming started again, but now it was weaker, more desperate. As if the woman was running out of strength, White Feather dismounted about 50 yards from the crest of the hill and crept forward on foot, his Winchester rifle ready in his hands. He'd learned long ago that it was better to see trouble before trouble saw you, and the hair on the back of his neck was standing up in a way that meant danger was close. What he saw when he reached the top of the hill made his blood run cold. Woman's head was protruding from the earth about 20 feet away, her auburn hair matted with sweat and dirt, her face streaked with tears and dust. She was buried up to her neck in the hard-packed soil, and from the look of the disturbed earth around her, she'd been there for some time. White Feather had seen a lot of cruelty in his life, but this was something beyond anything he'd witnessed. Someone had deliberately buried this woman alive and left her to die, and from the professional way the hole had been dug, it hadn't been the work of a single madman, but a group of men who'd planned this torture carefully. The woman's eyes were closed and her lips were moving silently. At first, White Feather thought she might be praying, but as he crept closer, he realized she was counting 1, 2, 3, 4 over and over again, as if she were trying to keep herself sane by focusing on something simple and concrete. Was about to call out to her when his tracker's instincts kicked in. Something was wrong with this picture beyond the obvious horror of the situation. The earth around the woman had been disturbed recently, but not by digging. Someone had been here after she was buried, and from the boot prints in the dust, that someone had stood right where he was standing now, looking down at her. White Feather's eyes swept the surrounding area, and he spotted what he was looking for, a vantage point about 100 yards away, where someone could watch the hilltop without being seen. Fresh horse droppings and the remains of a small fire told him that someone had been camping there, probably watching to see if anyone would come to the woman's aid. It was a trap, or at least a test, and White Feather was walking right into it. Smart thing would be to leave. He had no idea who this woman was, or what she'd done to deserve this fate. For all he knew, she could be a murderer or a thief, and helping her could put him on the wrong side of the local law. But as he looked down at her face, streaked with tears and dirt, he saw something that reminded him of his mother, not physically, but in the way she was enduring suffering with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength. His mother had never begged, even when the soldiers were dragging her away from the only home she'd ever known. She'd held her head high and sung the old songs under her breath, and she died with that same dignity intact. This woman had that same quality, and White Feather knew he couldn't leave her to die. Trap or no trap, he made his decision quickly. Moving with the silent grace that had made him one of the most sought-after trackers in the territory, he slipped back down the hill to where he'd left his horse. He needed tools to dig her out, and he needed to do it fast before whoever was watching decided to make their move. From his saddlebags, he pulled out a small folding shovel, a pickaxe, and a length of rope. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He also checked his weapons, the Winchester rifle, a Colt .45 revolver, and a bone-handled knife his mother had given him, and made sure they were all loaded and ready. As he climbed back up the hill, White Feather tried to put himself in the mindset of whoever had done this. They'd wanted the woman to suffer, obviously, but they'd also wanted to see if anyone would try to help her. That meant they were probably still watching, waiting to see what he would do. Well, he'd give them something to watch. "Ma'am," he said, softly as he approached the buried woman. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, White Feather saw pure terror in them. Then, as she focused on his face, the terror was replaced by something that might have been hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't leave me here." "I'm not going anywhere," White Feather said, dropping to his knees beside her. "My name is White Feather, and I'm going to get you out of this. But I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you, understand?" She nodded weakly, and White Feather began to dig. The earth was hard-packed and full of stones, and every shovelful felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But White Feather had learned patience from his mother's people, and he worked steadily, methodically, pausing only to wipe the sweat from his eyes and check the surrounding area for signs of movement. As he dug, the woman told him her story in halting whispers. Her name was Marlena Fairchild, and she'd been married to a rancher named Josiah Blackthorne, who decided that her failure to produce children was a sign from God that she needed to be punished. "He said if God wanted me to live, he'd send someone to save me," she said, her voice growing stronger as more of her body was freed from the earth. "I stopped believing that would happen." "Well, your God works in mysterious ways," White Feather said, not mentioning that he'd stopped believing in any God, white or Indian, a long time ago. "Just keep talking to me, Marlena. Tell me about your life before you came out here." As she talked, White Feather learned that she'd been born in Philadelphia, the daughter of a textile merchant who'd fallen on hard times. She'd been educated, well-read, and had dreams of seeing the world before she'd been essentially sold into marriage to pay her father's debts. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said as White Feather worked to free her arms. "I wanted to help children learn to read and write. Foolish dreams, I suppose." "Dreams aren't foolish," White Feather said, thinking of his own abandoned dreams of bridging the gap between the white and Indian worlds. "Sometimes they're the only things that keep us going." It took him nearly 2 hours to dig her out completely, and by the time he'd freed her legs, Marlena was barely conscious. Her body had been compressed in the earth for so long that she couldn't stand, and White Feather had to carry her to his horse like a child. As he lifted her into the saddle, he felt how light she was, how fragile. She'd been starved and abused for God knew how long before being buried, and it was a miracle she was still alive. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said, climbing up behind her and wrapping his arms around her to keep her from falling. "No," she said with more strength than he'd expected. "They'll just send me back to him. In this territory, a woman belongs to her husband, no matter what he does to her." White Feather knew she was right. The law out here was whatever the local ranchers and businessmen said it was, and a woman's word meant nothing against her husband's. If he took her to town, she'd be returned to Josiah Blackthorne, and next time, there might not be anyone around to hear her screams. "Then where do you want to go?" he asked. Marlena was quiet for a long moment, and White Feather could feel her thinking, weighing her options. Finally she said, "I don't know. I have nowhere to go, no money, no family who would take me in. I'm a dead woman walking." "No," White Feather said firmly. "You're a woman who survived something that would have killed most people. That makes you stronger than you know." As they rode away from that hellish hilltop, White Feather made a decision. That would change both their lives. He had a small cabin in the mountains, a place where he went to escape the world and remember his mother's teachings. It was isolated, hidden, and far from the reach of men like Josiah Blackthorne. "I know a place," he said. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can heal and decide what you want to do with the rest of your life." Marlena didn't answer, but White Feather felt her relax against him, and he knew she was placing her trust in a stranger, something that probably went against every instinct she had left. As they rode through the night toward the mountains, White Feather found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. He'd been drifting for so long, living day to day, job to job, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose beyond mere survival. Now, with this broken woman in his arms, he felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt since. His mother died, the desire to protect something precious, to fight for something that mattered, behind them. The hilltop where Marlena had been buried disappeared into the darkness, but White Feather knew it wasn't over. Men like Josiah Blackthorne didn't just let their property walk away, and sooner or later there would be a reckoning. But for now, they were free, and that was enough. The mountain cabin was still 3 days' ride away, but White Feather knew they would make it. He had to believe they would make it, because the alternative that Marlena would die in his arms after surviving so much was unthinkable. As the first light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, White Feather felt Marlena's breathing even out as she fell into what he hoped was healing sleep. He adjusted his grip on the reins and settled in for the long ride ahead, knowing that he was no longer just a drifter following the next job. He was a man with a mission, and that mission was to help this woman find her way back to life, whatever it took. The cabin appeared through the morning mist like something from a dream, nestled in a grove of ancient pines that seemed to stand guard against the world below. White Feather's sanctuary sat at the edge of a crystal-clear lake that reflected the snow-capped peaks surrounding them, and for the first time in 4 years, Marlena felt something approaching peace settle in her chest. She'd slept fitfully during the 3-day journey into the mountains, her body racked with fever from infection and exhaustion. But White Feather had been patient, stopping frequently to let her rest and forcing her to drink water from mountain streams that tasted like freedom itself. Now, as he helped her down from his horse, she could barely stand on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "Easy," White Feather said, his strong arm supporting her weight. "We're safe now. This place has been my refuge for 5 years, and no one else knows it exists." The cabin was simple but well built, constructed from logs that had been fitted together with the precision of a master craftsman. Inside, Marlena was surprised to find it furnished with handmade furniture that showed both practical skill and artistic sensibility. Cheyenne blankets hung on the walls alongside paintings of mountain landscapes that captured the raw beauty of their surroundings with startling accuracy. "You painted these?" she asked, her voice hoarse but filled with wonder. White Feather nodded, suddenly seeming almost shy. My mother taught me that art helps heal the spirit. After she died, I found that painting these mountains helped me remember who I was supposed to be. He helped her to a comfortable chair by the stone fireplace and began building a fire with movements that spoke of long practice. As the flames caught and began to warm the small space, Marlena felt herself truly relaxing for the first time in years. There's a room in the back where you can rest, White Feather said. I've got medical supplies, food, clean clothes. Everything you need to get your strength back. Marlena wanted to thank him, to express the gratitude that filled her heart to Q. Overflowing, but the words seemed inadequate. Instead, she simply nodded and allowed him to guide her to a small bedroom that was clean and comfortable, with a window that looked out over the lake. Sleep, White Feather said gently. I'll be here when you wake up. You're safe now. As Marlena settled into the first real bed she'd experienced in years, she felt tears streaming down her face, not tears of sorrow, but tears of relief so profound it was almost painful. For the first time since her wedding day, she fell asleep. Without fear. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky, and she could hear White Feather moving around in the main room of the cabin. The smell of cooking food made her stomach growl, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a real meal in longer than she could remember. She found him at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven in a large pot. He'd changed from his travel clothes into clean pants and a white shirt that emphasized his mixed heritage. The sharp cheekbones and dark eyes of his Cheyenne mother, combined with the height and broad shoulders of his white father. Venison stew, he said without turning around. My mother's recipe. She always said that food made with love could heal more than just the body. Marlena sat at the small wooden table and accepted the bowl he offered her. The first spoonful brought tears to her eyes, not just because it tasted better than anything she'd eaten in years, but because it had been prepared with a kindness she'd forgotten existed. Tell me about her, she said. Your mother. White Feather sat across from her, his own bowl untouched. Singing Bird was her name. She was the daughter of a Cheyenne chief, beautiful and proud, and completely unafraid of anything. My father was a cavalry officer who was supposed to be negotiating with her people, but he fell in love with her instead. He paused, staring into his stew as if he could see the past reflected there. It didn't last, of course. When the army transferred him back east, he left without a word. My mother never spoke bitterly of him, but I could see the hurt in her eyes whenever I asked about him. How did you end up living in both worlds? Marlena asked. After the government forced our people onto the reservation, my mother realized that I would need to know the white man's ways to survive. She taught me Cheyenne traditions and values at home, but she also made sure I learned to read and write and speak English without an accent. She said I was meant to be a bridge between two worlds. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Marlena reached across the table to touch his hand. What happened to her? Smallpox. It swept through the reservation when I was 22, and she was one of the first to die. I buried her in the traditional way, in the mountains where she was born, and then I left. I couldn't stay on the reservation and watch our people slowly dying of despair, but I couldn't fit into the white world either. So I became a drifter, hiring out my tracking skills and trying to forget everything she'd taught me about purpose and belonging. Marlena felt her heart ache for this man who had saved her life. Like her, he'd been damaged by forces beyond his control, shaped by loss and abandonment into someone who existed on the margins of society. She would be proud of you, she said softly. You saved my life. That means something. White Feather looked up at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his dark eyes. I've been thinking about that. About why I happened to be in that exact place at that exact time to hear your screams. My mother would have said it was the spirits guiding me, but I stopped believing in that kind of thing a long time ago. Maybe you should start believing again, Marlena said. Maybe some things are meant to happen. They spent the next several days establishing a routine that felt surprisingly natural. White Feather would hunt and fish while Marlena rested and gradually regained her strength. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Slowly, carefully, they began to trust each other. Marlena learned that White Feather was not just a skilled tracker, but also a gifted artist, a thoughtful philosopher, and a man with a deep appreciation for beauty. In all its forms. He would point out the way the light hit the mountains at different times of day, or bring her wildflowers he'd found during his hunting trips, or read to her from books of poetry he kept hidden under his bed. White Feather, in turn, discovered that Marlena was far more than the broken woman he'd rescued from that hilltop. As her physical strength returned, so did her intelligence, her wit, and her fierce determination to never again allow anyone to control her life. She began helping with cooking and cleaning, and she started painting alongside him, finding that art provided an outlet for emotions she couldn't express in words. "You have real talent," White Feather said one afternoon as he studied a landscape she'd completed that morning. "Have you ever painted before?" "Never," Marlena admitted. "But there's something about this place that makes me want to capture it, to hold on to it somehow. That's what my mother used to say about the old ways. She said that keeping them alive through art and story was the only way to ensure they wouldn't be forgotten." It was during their third week together that Marlena made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been exploring the cabin while White Feather was out checking his hunting traps, and she'd found a wooden box hidden behind some books on a high shelf. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to White Feather, but bearing different names: Joseph Whitman, Joe White, W.F. Whitman. The letters were from various law enforcement agencies, bounty hunters, and private individuals, all offering substantial rewards for information about missing persons, stolen cattle, and wanted criminals. What made Marlena's heart race was the realization that these were not requests for White Feather's services as a tracker. They were evidence that he was one of the most successful bounty hunters in the territory. But it was the last letter in the box that made her blood run cold. It was dated just 2 weeks before White Feather had found her, and it was from Josiah Blackthorne himself. "Mr. Whitman," the letter read, "I am in need of your tracking services to locate my wife, who has run away from our ranch. She is mentally unstable and dangerous, and I fear for her safety and the safety of others. I am prepared to pay $500 for her safe return, plus an additional $200 if you can locate her within 1 week. Her name is Marlena Fairchild Blackthorne, and I have enclosed a photograph and description." Marlena's hands shook as she realized the implications. White Feather hadn't just happened to find her, he'd been hired to find her. Everything about their meeting, his rescue, his kindness, had been a lie. He was planning to return her to Josiah for the reward money. The sound of his boots on the cabin porch sent her into a panic. She quickly replaced the box and tried to compose herself. But when White Feather entered the cabin, he immediately noticed something was wrong. "Marlena, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." She turned to face him, and all the trust and affection she'd been building over the past weeks crumbled into ash. "I know who you are," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I know about the bounty." White Feather's face went completely still, and Marlena saw the exact moment when he realized what she'd discovered. The guilt in his eyes confirmed her worst fears. "You were hired to find me," she continued, backing toward the door. "All of this, the rescue, the kindness, the sanctuary, it was all just part of your plan to earn Josiah's reward money." "No," White Feather said, taking a step toward her. "Marlena, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice rising. "I understand that I was a fool to trust another man who saw me as nothing more than property to be bought and sold, The only difference is that you were kinder about it than Josiah was." "That's not true," Whitefeather said desperately. "Yes, I received the letter. Yes, I was tracking you when I heard your screams. But the moment I saw what had been done to you, everything changed. I never intended to return you to him. I was going to tell you about the letter, but I wanted to wait until you were stronger." Marlena laughed bitterly. "How convenient. And I suppose you were planning to refuse the reward money out of the goodness of your heart?" "I've never cared about money," Whitefeather said. "If I had, I would have taken you straight back to your husband, instead of bringing you here and spending 3 weeks nursing you back to health." "Then why didn't you tell me?" Marlena demanded. "Why did you let me believe that our meeting was fate instead of a business transaction?" Whitefeather ran his hands through his hair, and Marlena could see the struggle playing out on his face. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd never trust me again. And I needed you to trust me, Marlena. I needed you to see me as more than just another bounty hunter looking to make a profit." "Why?" she asked. "Why did it matter what I thought of you?" Whitefeather looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I had a purpose again. Because taking care of you, watching you heal, seeing you smile, it made me remember what it felt like to be human instead of just surviving." Marlena felt her anger wavering in the face of his obvious pain, but she forced herself to remain strong. She'd been manipulated by one man's lies already, and she wouldn't allow herself to fall into the same trap again. "I can't stay here," she said. "I can't trust you, and I can't live with the knowledge that you were paid to hunt me down like an animal." "Where will you go?" Whitefeather asked. "You have no money, no supplies, no knowledge of this country. If you leave here alone, you'll die." "Then I'll die free," Marlena said. "That's more than I've been for the past 4 years." She moved toward the door, but Whitefeather stepped in front of her. "Please," he said. "Give me a chance to explain. Give me a chance to make this right." "How?" Marlena demanded. "How can you possibly make this right? You lied to me about everything." "I'll send a letter to your husband," Whitefeather said desperately. "I'll tell him I couldn't find you, that the trail went cold. I'll refuse the reward money and tell him to stop looking. And you think that will be enough? You think that will erase the fact that you deceived me from the very beginning?" Whitefeather was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. "No," he said. "I don't think it will be enough, but it's all I can offer." Marlena looked at him, this man who had saved her life, who had shown her kindness when she'd forgotten such a thing existed, who had given her a glimpse of what happiness might feel like. Part of her wanted to forgive him, to believe that his feelings were genuine despite the deception. But the larger part of her, the part that had been shaped by 4 years of manipulation and abuse, couldn't take that risk. "I need time," she said finally. "I need time to think, to decide what I want to do." Whitefeather nodded, stepping aside. To let her pass. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here when you're ready to talk." Marlena walked out of the cabin and down to the lake, where she sat on a fallen log and tried to sort through the chaos in her mind. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and she couldn't help thinking about how many evenings she'd spent watching the sunset with Whitefeather, believing that she'd finally found a place where she belonged. Now she had to face the possibility that it had all been an illusion, just another form of captivity disguised as freedom. But as she sat there by the water, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Marlena realized that regardless of Whitefeather's original motives, he had given her something invaluable, the knowledge that she was strong enough to survive. Anything, whether she stayed or left, whether she forgave him or not, she was no longer the broken woman who had been buried alive in the Wyoming desert. She was someone new, someone who had choices and the courage to make them. And tomorrow, She would decide what those choices would be. 3 days had passed since Marlene had discovered the truth about White Feather's original mission. And the cabin, that had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. They moved around each other like wary animals, speaking only when necessary. The easy intimacy they'd built over weeks shattered by the weight of his deception. White Feather had tried multiple times to bridge the gap between them, bringing her wildflowers that she left untouched, preparing her favorite meals that she barely ate, and attempting conversations that died in awkward silence. But Marlene remained distant, her walls rebuilt higher and stronger than before. It was on the 4th morning that everything changed. White Feather was returning from checking his rabbit snares when he spotted the smoke rising from the valley below. It was too much smoke for a campfire and too controlled for a wildfire, which meant only one thing. Riders were coming, and they were burning everything in their path to flush out their quarry. He ran back to the cabin, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since the day he'd buried his mother. Marlene was sitting by the window, reading one of his books, when he burst through the door. "We have to leave," he said, grabbing his rifle and ammunition. Now, Marlene looked up, startled by the urgency in his voice. "What's wrong?" "Riders in the valley. At least a dozen of them, maybe more. They're burning the forest to drive us out." White Feather was already packing essential supplies into his saddlebags. "Your husband found us." The color drained from Marlene's face. "How? This place is supposed to be secret." "Someone talked," White Feather said grimly. "Or someone followed our trail. It doesn't matter now. What matters is getting you somewhere safe." But even as he said it, White Feather knew their options were limited. The mountain had only 3 ways down, and Josiah's men could easily cover all of them. They were trapped, and the only question was whether they could find a defensible position before the net closed completely. "There's a cave system about 2 miles north," he said, shouldering his pack. "It's hidden behind a waterfall, and there are multiple ways in and out. If we can reach it before they spot us, we might be able to wait them out." Marlene stood up, and White Feather was surprised to see that her fear had been replaced by something harder and more determined. "No," she said. "I'm tired of running." "Marlene, be reasonable. There are too many of them for us to fight." "I'm not talking about fighting," she said, moving to the window and looking down at the smoke rising from the valley. "I'm talking about ending this once and for all." White Feather stared at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we give Josiah exactly what he wants," Marlene said, turning to face him. "Me? Absolutely not," White Feather said immediately. "You know what he'll do to you." "Yes, I do. But I also know what he'll do to you if he finds us together. He'll kill you slowly, and he'll make me watch. At least if I surrender myself, you'll have a chance to escape." White Feather felt something cold settle in his chest. "You think I would let you sacrifice yourself to save me? I think you're a practical man who understands that one of us surviving is better than both of us dying," Marlene said. "Besides, you got what you wanted. You found me. Your job is done." The words hit White Feather like a physical blow. "Is that what you think? That I still see you as a job?" "I don't know what you see me as," Marlene said. "But I know I can't keep running forever. And I won't be responsible for your death." Before White Feather could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the lake. They both moved to the window and saw a lone rider approaching the cabin under a white flag. The man was tall and gaunt, wearing the black coat and white collar of a preacher. "Reverend Matthias Kane," Marlene whispered, her face going pale. "Josiah's spiritual advisor. The one who convinced him that burying me alive was God's will." White Feather checked his rifle. "What does he want?" "To negotiate, probably. Josiah likes to think of himself as a civilized man, even when he's doing monstrous things." The Reverend stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the water. "Mrs. Blackthorne, I know you're in there. Your husband has sent me to offer you terms." Marlena moved toward the door, but White Feather caught her arm. "Don't," he said. "Whatever he's offering, it's a trap." "I know," Marlena said. "But I need to hear it." She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, with White Feather close behind her. Reverend Cain smiled when he saw her, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "My dear child," he called out, "you look well. Much better than when we last saw you." "No thanks to you," Marlena replied. "What do you want, Reverend?" "Your husband is prepared to forgive your transgression," Cain said. "He understands that. You were not in your right mind when you ran away, and he's willing to take you back without punishment if you come willingly." Marlena laughed bitterly. "Without punishment? He buried me alive. That was a test of faith," Cain said smoothly. "A test that you failed by accepting help from this heathen. But Mr. Blackthorne is a Christian man, and he believes in redemption. And if I refuse?" Cain's smile widened. "Then we'll take you by force, and your Indian friend will die slowly for the crime of stealing another man's property. We have 20 armed men surrounding this mountain, Mrs. Blackthorne. Resistance is futile." White Feather stepped forward, his rifle ready. "She's not going anywhere with you." "Ah, the noble savage speaks," Cain said mockingly. "Tell me, Mr. Whitman, yes, we know who you are. How much did my employer pay you to find his wife? Was it worth betraying your own principles?" White Feather felt Marlena's eyes on him, and he knew that Cain was deliberately trying to drive a wedge between them. "I'm not returning her to him," he said. "No? Then perhaps you'd like to keep her for yourself. I understand that men of your mixed heritage have certain appetites that civilized women find distasteful." White Feather's finger tightened on the trigger, but Marlena placed a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's what he wants." Cain pulled out a pocket. "Watch and check the time. You have 10 minutes to decide, Mrs. Blackthorne. Come with me willingly, and your friend lives. Refuse, and we'll burn this cabin with both of you inside." The Reverend turned his horse and rode back toward the tree line, leaving them alone with their impossible choice. "I have to go," Marlena said immediately. "It's the only way." "No," White Feather said. "There has to be another option." "What option?" You heard him. 20 armed men. "Even if we could fight our way out, where would we go? This will never end as long as I'm alive." White Feather stared at her, seeing the resignation in her eyes, and suddenly he understood what she was really saying. "You're not planning to go back to him," he said. "You're planning to end this permanently." Marlena didn't deny it. "I've been dead for 4 years, White Feather. At least this way, my death will have meaning." "Your life has meaning," White Feather said desperately. "Your life has meaning to me, does it?" Marlena asked. "Or am I just another lost cause that helps you feel better about yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, and White Feather realized that this was his chance to finally tell her the truth, not the partial truth he'd been offering, but the complete, terrifying truth about what she'd come to mean to him. "You want to know what you mean to me?" he said. "You mean everything. You mean that I wake up every morning excited to see your face. You mean that I've started planning a future for the first time in 10 years. You mean that I've remembered what it feels like to hope." Marlena's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "That's not enough," she said. "Hope doesn't stop bullets. Love doesn't change the fact that I'm still legally his property." "Then we'll change the law," White Feather said. "We'll go to California, or Oregon, or Mexico, somewhere his reach can't follow, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, wondering when he'll catch up to us. That's not living, White Feather. That's just another kind of prison." White Feather felt his world crumbling around him. After years of existing without purpose, he'd finally found something worth fighting for, and now it was slipping through his fingers like water. "There is another way," he said suddenly. "What?" We kill him, Marlena stared at him. What? We kill? Josiah Blackthorn, Whitefeather repeated. Tonight, while he's sleeping in his camp. I can get close enough to take him out before his men know what's happening. That's murder, Marlena said. That's justice, Whitefeather replied. That man buried you alive and would have left you to die. He's a monster, and the world would. Be better off without him. And then what? His men would hunt us down and kill us both. You'd be throwing your life away for nothing. Not for nothing, Whitefeather said. For you, for the chance that you might have a real life someday. Marlena looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his words. Finally, she shook her head. I won't let you become a killer for my sake. I won't have that on my conscience. Then what? Whitefeather asked. What do you suggest we do? Before Marlena could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted from the forest. Below, they both turned to see muzzle flashes lighting up the tree line, and Whitefeather realized with a sinking heart that their 10 minutes were up. They're coming, he said, checking his weapons. We're out of time. Marlena moved to the window and looked down at the approaching riders. There are too many of them, she said. We'll never be able to fight them all. Then we run, Whitefeather sighed. We head for the cave system and hope we can lose them in the tunnels. No, Marlena said firmly. I told you, I'm done running. She moved toward the door, but Whitefeather grabbed her arm. Marlena, please, don't do this. She turned to look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. Not resignation, but determination. I love you, she said. Simply, I need you to know that. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that these past few weeks have been the happiest of my life. Marlena, but I also need you to know that I'm not the same woman you rescued from that hillside. I'm not a victim anymore. I'm a survivor, and survivors make their own choices. She pulled free from his grip and walked to the gun cabinet where Whitefeather kept his spare weapons. She selected a Colt .45 revolver and checked to make sure it was loaded. What are you doing? Whitefeather asked. Something I should have done 4 years ago, Marlena said. I'm taking control of my own story. The riders were close now, close enough that they could hear individual voices shouting orders. Whitefeather estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before the cabin was surrounded. If you're determined to do this, he said, then we do it together. Marlena looked at him. What? You heard me. If you're going to face him, then I'm going to be right beside you. Partners. Whitefeather, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, he said, moving to stand beside her. I understand that you're the bravest woman I've ever met, and I understand that I'd rather die fighting alongside you than live the rest of my life knowing I let you face this alone. Marlena stared at him, and for the first time in days, she smiled. You're absolutely insane. Probably, Whitefeather agreed. But I'm your kind of insane. The sound of hoofbeats was very close now, and they could see torches moving through the trees. Whitefeather and Marlena took positions on either side of the cabin's main window, their weapons ready. Whatever happens, Whitefeather said, I want you to know that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though I've probably gotten you killed. Marlena asked. Especially because of that, Whitefeather replied. I was already dead, Marlena. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. You gave me a reason to live again. The first of Josiah's men emerged from the tree line, and Whitefeather felt his finger tighten on the trigger. This was it. This was where their story would end, not with a whimper, but with a bang. But as he looked at Marlena, her face illuminated by the firelight and her eyes blazing with determination, Whitefeather realized that maybe this wasn't an ending at all. Maybe this was just the beginning of the most important fight of their lives. The riders were almost to the cabin now, and Whitefeather could see Josiah Blackthorn himself leading the charge, his face twisted with rage and religious fervor. Behind him rode his army of hired guns and fanatics, all of them convinced that they were doing God's work. "Ready?" White Feather asked. "Ready," Marlena replied, and as the first shot rang out across the mountain lake, White Feather knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The first bullet shattered the cabin window just inches from White Feather's head, sending splinters of wood and glass flying across the room. He dropped to one knee and returned fire, his shot finding its mark in the shoulder of one of Josiah's riders, who tumbled from his horse with a scream that echoed across the lake. "Get down!" White Feather shouted to Marlena, who had taken cover behind the overturned kitchen table. But instead of cowering, she was methodically checking her ammunition, her face calm and focused in a way that reminded him of a warrior preparing for battle. "How many shots do you have?" she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Enough," White Feather replied, taking aim at another rider. "But we need to be smart about this. They'll try to flank us from both sides." As if summoned by his words, gunfire erupted from the back of the cabin. Josiah's men had indeed split their forces, and now bullets were coming through both the front and rear windows. White Feather cursed under his breath and moved toward the back room, leaving Marlena to cover the front. "Don't you dare try to protect me," Marlena shouted after him. "We're partners, remember?" White Feather smiled grimly as he positioned himself at the back window. Even in the middle of a firefight, she was reminding him that she was nobody's victim anymore. He could see 3 men advancing through the trees, using the darkness and smoke as cover. His first shot dropped the lead man immediately. The second wounded another, sending him scrambling for cover behind a fallen log. The third man, realizing he was exposed, retreated back into the forest to await reinforcements. From the front of the cabin, Marlena's revolver cracked twice in quick succession, followed by a man's scream and the sound of a horse bolting in panic. White Feather felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. She was holding her own, but they were still outnumbered at least 10-1. "Marlena Blackthorn." Josiah's voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "I know you. Can hear me. This ends now." The gunfire paused momentarily, and in the sudden silence, White Feather could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He moved back to the front room, where Marlena was reloading her weapon with practiced efficiency. "You have 1 minute to come out with your hands up," Josiah continued. "If you surrender now, I promise your heathen friend will die quickly." Marlena's jaw tightened. "He still thinks he owns me," she said, more to herself than to White Feather. "Let him think what he wants," White Feather replied. "As long as he keeps talking, he's not shooting." But even as he said it, White Feather knew their situation was desperate. They had maybe 40 rounds of ammunition between them, while Josiah's men could maintain their siege indefinitely. Worse, the cabin was built from dry wood that would go up like a torch if anyone managed to throw a firebrand onto the roof. 30 seconds. Josiah called out. Marlena stood up from behind the table and moved toward the door. For a moment, White Feather thought she was going to surrender after all, but instead, she threw the door open and stepped onto the porch, her revolver held loosely at her side. "Hello, husband," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "You're looking well for a man who's been chasing ghosts across half the territory." White Feather positioned himself just inside the doorway, his rifle trained on the tree line where he could see the glint of metal and the occasional muzzle flash. If anyone took a shot at Marlena, he would make them pay for it. Josiah emerged from the forest, flanked by Reverend Cain and 4 heavily armed men. He looked older than White Feather had expected, with gray streaking his dark hair and lines of anger etched permanently into his face. But his eyes still burned with the fanatics' certainty that had made him dangerous 4 years ago. "You've led me quite a chase, my dear," Josiah said, his voice deceptively calm. "But it's over now. Come home where you belong." "This is where I belong," Marlena replied, gesturing toward the cabin behind her. "With a man who sees me as a human. Being instead of livestock." Josiah's face darkened. "You are my wife. You swore before God to obey me." "I swore before a false god," Marlena said. "The real God doesn't demand that women be buried alive for failing to breed like cattle." "Blasphemy!" Reverend Cain shouted, stepping forward with his Bible clutched in his hands. "The woman is possessed by demons. She must be cleansed." "The only demon here is standing right in front of me," Marlena said, her gaze never leaving Josiah's face. "You turned marriage into slavery, love into torture, and faith into an excuse for cruelty. You're not a man of God, you're a monster who hides behind Scripture." White Feather saw Josiah's hand move toward his gun and knew the talking was over. "Marlena, get down!" He shouted, but she was already moving, diving to the side as Josiah's pistol cleared leather. The shot went wide, and White Feather's return. Fire caught Josiah in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to his knees. But the gunshot had been a signal, and suddenly the forest erupted with muzzle flashes as Josiah's men opened fire on the cabin. Marlena rolled behind the porch, railing and returned fire, her shot taking down one of the flanking gunmen. White Feather provided covering fire from the doorway, methodically picking off targets as they exposed themselves. But they were running out of ammunition, and Josiah's men were getting bolder, advancing across the clearing in short rushes while their companions provided covering fire. White Feather realized with grim certainty that they had maybe 5 minutes before the cabin was overrun. "The dynamite!" Marlena shouted over the gunfire. "What?" White Feather called back, confused. "In your supply room. I saw dynamite when I was exploring, mining charges for clearing stumps." White Feather's mind raced. The dynamite could clear their attackers, but it would also destroy the cabin and everything in it. Still, it was better than dying slowly at Josiah's hands. "Cover me!" he shouted and sprinted toward the back room where he kept his mining supplies. The dynamite was exactly where Marlena had said it would be. 6 sticks of high-grade explosive with fuses and blasting caps. White Feather grabbed 3 sticks and a box of matches, his hands surprisingly steady despite the chaos around him. When he returned to the front room, he found Marlena had been hit. Blood was seeping through her shirt sleeve, but she was still firing, her face set in grim determination. "How bad?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Just a graze," she said through gritted teeth. "But they're getting closer." White Feather could see she was right. Josiah's men had advanced to within 30 yards of the cabin, and it was only a matter of time before they rushed the building en masse. "When I light this fuse," he said, holding up the dynamite, "we have maybe 20 seconds to get to the back room and take cover." Marlena nodded, ejecting the spent shells from her revolver. "What about after? Even if we survive the blast, we'll still be outnumbered." "Maybe not," White Feather said, striking a match. "If we take out enough of them, the rest might lose their stomach for this fight." He lit the fuse and tossed the dynamite toward the front of the clearing where most of Josiah's men had taken cover. Then he grabbed Marlena and pulled her toward the back room, both of them diving behind his heavy oak workbench just as the world exploded. The blast was deafening, a concussion that seemed to shake the very mountains. The cabin's front wall disintegrated, and White Feather felt debris raining down on them like hail. His ears were ringing so loudly that he couldn't hear anything else, but through the smoke and dust, he could see bodies scattered across the clearing. The explosion had done its work. Of the 20 men who had surrounded the cabin, at least half were down, either dead or too wounded to continue fighting. The survivors were retreating toward the tree line, their confidence shattered by the devastating blast. But Josiah Blackthorn was still alive. White Feather could see him through the smoke, his clothes torn and his face bloodied, but his eyes still burning with fanatic determination. He was dragging himself toward the cabin, a pistol clutched in his good hand. "Marlena!" Josiah screamed, his voice barely audible over the ringing in White Feather's ears. "You cannot escape God's judgment." White Feather tried to reach for his rifle, but it had been buried under debris from the explosion. His revolver was gone too, lost somewhere in the chaos. All he had left was the bone-handled knife his mother had given him. Marlena stood beside him, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Her revolver was still in her hand, but White Feather could see that the cylinder had been damaged by flying debris. She tried to fire, but the gun just clicked uselessly. Josiah had reached the remains of the porch and was pulling himself to his feet, his pistol aimed directly at Marlena's heart. 4 years, he snarled. 4 years I've searched for you. 4 years of humiliation and mockery from my neighbors. But it ends tonight. Yes, it does, Marlena said, and White Feather was amazed by the calmness in her voice. She showed no fear, no regret, only a quiet dignity that reminded him of his mother facing the cavalry soldiers who had come to take her people away. "You were supposed to be my legacy," Josiah continued, his finger tightening on the trigger. "My sons were supposed to carry my name into the future. But you failed me. You failed God, and now you'll pay the price." "I never failed God," Marlena said. "I failed you. And that was the smartest thing I ever did." Josiah's face contorted with rage, and White Feather knew he was about to fire. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his mother's knife flashing in. The firelight, the blade took Josiah in the side, sliding between his ribs and finding his heart. The rancher's eyes went wide with shock, and his pistol fell from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the knife protruding from his chest, then up at White Feather's face. "Heathen," he whispered, and then he fell forward, dead before he hit. The ground. White Feather stood over Josiah's body, breathing heavily. After 4 years of hunting and being hunted, it was over. The monster who had buried Marlena alive, who had tortured and controlled her, would never hurt anyone again. "Is he dead?" Marlena asked, struggling to sit up. White Feather knelt in. Checked for a pulse. "Yes, it's over." Marlena closed her eyes and let out a long breath. "I can't believe it. After all this time, he's really gone. What about the others?" White Feather asked, looking toward the tree line where the surviving gunman had taken cover. As if in answer to his question, Reverend Cain's voice called out from the forest. "Mr. Blackthorne is dead. The contract is void. Every man for himself." The sound of horses moving away rapidly followed, as the remaining hired guns decided that their pay wasn't worth dying for. Within minutes, the mountain was quiet except for the crackling of small fires started by the explosion. White Feather helped Marlena to her feet, both of them surveying the destruction that had once been their sanctuary. The front half of the cabin was gone, and most of their possessions were destroyed or scattered. But they were alive, and more importantly, they were free. "What do we do now?" Marlena asked, leaning against him for support. White Feather looked around at the devastation, then down at the woman in his arms. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We make a new life, a better life, together. Here? If you want, or somewhere else. It doesn't matter where, as long as we're together." Marlena smiled, and despite everything they'd been through, it was the most beautiful thing White Feather had ever seen. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." He replied, and kissed her as the sun began to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that promised new beginnings. 6 months later, a small wedding took place in the rebuilt cabin by the mountain lake. There were no guests except for the wildlife and the wind in the pines, but neither White Feather nor Marlena wanted it any other way. They had learned that the most important promises were the ones made in private, between two hearts that had found their way to each other through darkness and pain. Marlena took her husband's Cheyenne name, becoming known to the few neighbors they eventually made as Mary White Feather. She never spoke of her previous marriage or the horrors she had endured. But those who met her were struck by her quiet strength, and the way she seemed to find joy in the simplest things: a sunset over the lake, the first wildflowers of spring, the sound of her husband's laughter. White Feather gave up bounty hunting and became a guide for travelers, crossing the mountains, using his tracking skills to help lost souls find their way home instead of hunting them down for money. He and Marlena built a good life together, one based on mutual respect, genuine love, and the shared understanding of what it meant to survive the impossible. They never had children, but neither of them minded. They had each other, and they had learned that sometimes the greatest legacy you can leave is simply the courage to keep choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and life over death. And on quiet evenings, when the lake was still and the mountains seemed to hold their breath, Marlena would sometimes tell White Feather about her dreams. Not the nightmares that had haunted her for years, but new dreams of the future they were building together, one day at a time. The woman who had once been buried alive in the Wyoming desert had not only survived, she had triumphed, finding not just freedom, but the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. 2 years later, spring 1890, the morning sun painted the rebuilt cabin in shades of gold and amber as Mary White Feather stepped onto the expanded porch, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. The structure was larger now, with additional rooms and a proper workshop where her husband crafted furniture that had become sought after by families throughout the territory. But more importantly, it had been built as a home rather than a hiding place, open, welcoming, and filled with the kind of warmth that only came from genuine happiness. She found White Feather by the lake, as she did most mornings, sitting on the dock they'd built together and watching the mist rise from the still water. At 34, he looked younger than when she'd first met him, the lines of constant vigilance smoothed away by 2 years of peace and purpose. His long black hair was braided with small beads that had been his mother's, a connection to his heritage that he'd reclaimed since their marriage. "The Hendersons should be here within the hour," Mary said, settling beside him and offering one of the cups. White Feather accepted the coffee with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Are you ready for this?" Mary considered the question, as she gazed across the lake toward the mountain trail where their visitors would soon appear. Today marked the beginning of something that had been growing in her mind for months, a way to transform their personal victory into something larger, something that could help other women trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped. "I think I've been ready my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it until now." Their story had spread throughout the Wyoming territory, despite their attempts to live quietly. Word of the woman who'd been buried alive and the half-Cheyenne tracker who'd saved her had traveled from ranch to ranch, saloon to saloon, becoming the kind of legend that grew with each telling. But what most people didn't know was the work Mary and White Feather had been doing over the past year, quietly helping other women escape abusive marriages, providing safe passage to California or Oregon, and connecting them with lawyers who specialized in challenging the territorial laws that treated women as property. The Hendersons were the latest family to request their help. Elizabeth Henderson was a 23-year-old woman whose husband had threatened to have her committed to an asylum for hysteria after she'd miscarried their 3rd child. Her brother James, a cattle rancher from Colorado, had written to White Feather asking for assistance in getting his sister to safety. "There's something else," Mary said, pulling a letter from her apron pocket. "This arrived yesterday with the Henderson correspondence." White Feather unfolded the paper, his eyebrows rising as he read. The letter was on official letterhead from the Territorial Governor's Office, signed by Governor Amos Barber himself. "Mrs. White Feather," the letter began, "your reputation as an advocate for women's rights has come to my attention through several prominent citizens who have benefited from your assistance. I would like to invite you to testify before a special legislative committee That is reviewing the territory's marriage and property laws. Your unique perspective and experience would be invaluable in helping us craft legislation that better protects the rights of all Wyoming citizens. They want you to go to Cheyenne, Whitefeather said, his voice filled with pride and concern in equal measure, to speak before the territorial legislature. Mary felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, the old fear of being exposed, judged, found wanting. But alongside the fear was something stronger, a sense of purpose that had been growing since the day she decided to stop running and face Josiah Blackthorne on her own terms. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Whitefeather said carefully, "that you're the bravest woman I've ever known. And if anyone can change the way this territory treats women, it's you. But I also think it's your choice to make." Before Mary could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the water. A small group of riders was cresting the hill, James Henderson, his sister Elizabeth, and what appeared to be 2 children. But as they drew closer, Mary realized that one of the children was actually a young woman, probably no more than 16, with the hollow eyes and careful movements of someone who'd learned to expect violence. 3 of them, Whitefeather observed. James didn't mention bringing anyone else. They walked up from the dock to meet their guests, and Mary's heart went out to Elizabeth Henderson the moment she saw her. The woman was clearly pregnant again, probably 4 or 5 months along, and her face bore the telltale signs of someone living in constant fear, the way she flinched when her brother reached over to help her down from her horse, the manner in which her eyes darted constantly around the clearing as if looking for threats. "Mrs. Whitefeather," James Henderson said, dismounting and removing his hat, "I can't thank you enough for agreeing to help us." "Please, call me Mary," she replied. "And who is this young lady?" The third woman had hung back, still mounted on her horse, as if ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. She was indeed very young, with pale blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "This is Sarah Mitchell, Elizabeth," Henderson said softly. She was married to my husband's business partner. When James came to get me, we found her locked in the cellar. Her husband had been keeping her there for weeks." Mary felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had sustained her through her own darkest moments. But she'd learned to channel that anger into action rather than letting it consume her. "Sarah," she said gently, approaching the girl's horse slowly, "you're safe now. No one here will hurt you or force you to do anything you don't want to do." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a small nod. Whitefeather appeared at Mary's shoulder, offering Sarah his hand to help her down from her horse. "We have plenty of room," he said quietly, "and all the time in the world." Over the next several hours, as their guests settled into the spare rooms Mary had prepared, the full scope of what they were attempting began to take shape. Elizabeth Henderson needed safe passage to San Francisco, where she had a cousin who ran a boarding house for women. Sarah Mitchell was even more desperate. She had nowhere to go and no family willing to take her in, making her completely dependent on their protection. But it was during the evening meal that the most significant revelation came to light. James Henderson, a successful rancher in his own right, had been quietly financing their underground network for months, using his business connections to help relocate women throughout the Western Territories. "There are more of us than you might think," he said as they sat around the expanded dining table Mary had insisted on when they rebuilt the cabin. "Men who are tired of seeing women treated like livestock. We've been organizing, contributing. Money, providing safe houses. How many?" Whitefeather asked. "Dozens, maybe hundreds. Ranchers, businessmen, even some politicians. The territory is changing, Mary. People are starting to realize that the old ways aren't working anymore." Mary felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that their personal struggle had become part of something much larger. The underground network they'd been building wasn't just about helping individual women escape. It was about fundamentally changing the way society viewed women's rights and autonomy. That's why the governor's invitation is so important, Elizabeth Henderson said, speaking up for the first time since dinner began. You have a chance to speak for all of us, all the women who can't speak for themselves. Mary looked around the table at these people who had come to her for help, and she realized that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being a victim and become a leader. The woman who had once been buried alive for failing to produce an heir was now being asked to help shape the laws that would govern an entire territory. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady and clear. I'll go to Cheyenne and tell them exactly what needs to change. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. White Feather worked with James Henderson to establish secure routes for her, getting Elizabeth and Sarah to safety, while Mary began writing the testimony she would deliver to the legislative committee. The process of putting her experiences into words that could influence policy was both cathartic and terrifying, forcing her to relive memories she'd tried to bury while also finding the strength to transform them into weapons for change. Sarah Mitchell proved to be an unexpected asset in this process. Despite her youth and trauma, she had a sharp intelligence and a gift for organizing information that made her invaluable in documenting the stories of other women they'd helped. She also had a fierce determination to prevent other girls from suffering as she had, channeling her pain into purpose in a way that reminded Mary of her own journey. We need to be specific about the legal changes we're requesting, Sarah said one evening as they worked on Mary's testimony by lamplight. It's not enough to say that women deserve better treatment. We need to propose actual laws. Mary marveled at the girl's insight. At 16, Sarah had already developed a more sophisticated understanding of political strategy than many adults. She'd suggested they focus on 3 key areas: the right of women to own property independently of their husbands, the right to seek divorce in cases of abuse, and the right to legal representation in domestic disputes. These aren't radical ideas. Sarah continued. Some of the eastern states already have similar laws. We're just asking Wyoming to catch up with the rest of the country. The night before Mary was scheduled to leave for Cheyenne, she and White Feather sat by the lake one final time, watching the stars reflect on the still water. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one that would take them beyond their mountain sanctuary and into the wider world. Are you nervous? White Feather asked. Terrified, Mary admitted, but also excited. For the first time in my life, I feel like I have something important to say. You've always had something important to say, White Feather replied. The difference is that now people are ready to listen. Mary leaned against her husband's shoulder, drawing strength from his steady presence. What if I fail? What if they don't take me seriously? Then you'll have tried, White Feather said simply. And that's more than most people ever do. The journey to Cheyenne took 3 days, with Mary traveling in a well-appointed carriage provided by James Henderson's business contacts. She wasn't making the trip alone. Sarah Mitchell had insisted on accompanying her, along with 2 other women whose stories would help illustrate the need for legal reform. The delegation had grown into something that felt more like a movement. The territorial capital was a bustling city that seemed to embody the changing nature of the American West. Cowboys and cattle barons shared the streets with lawyers and politicians, while women in fashionable dresses walked alongside others in practical frontier clothing. It was a place where old and new were colliding, creating opportunities for change that might not have existed even 5 years earlier. The legislative hearing was held in a grand chamber that intimidated Mary until she remembered all the women who were counting on her to speak their truth. As she took her place at the witness table, facing a room full of powerful men who would decide the fate of countless women, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a mantle. Mrs. White Feather, the committee chairman began, We understand you have some personal experience with the marriage laws of this territory. Mary looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some curious, a few openly hostile. Then she began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word as she told her story. Not the sanitized version that had become legend, but the raw, unvarnished truth of what she'd endured and survived. She spoke of being sold into marriage to pay her father's debts. She described the gradual erosion of her freedom, the escalating violence, the religious justification for cruelty. She told them about being buried alive and left to die, and about the man who'd risked everything to save her. But more importantly, she spoke about the dozens of other women whose stories had become intertwined with hers, women who were trapped in situations they couldn't escape because the law offered them no protection, no recourse, no hope. Gentlemen, she concluded, her voice ringing through the chamber, you have the power to ensure that no woman in this territory ever again has to choose between a living death and an actual grave. The question is whether you have the courage to use that power. The silence that followed her testimony was profound. Then, slowly, one of the committee members began to clap. Others joined in, until the entire chamber was filled with applause. 3 months later, the Wyoming Territory passed the most progressive women's rights legislation in the nation. The new laws gave women the right to own property, seek divorce in cases of abuse, and receive legal representation in domestic disputes. More importantly, they established a network of legal aid societies to help women navigate the system and escape dangerous situations. Mary White Feather became the first director of the Wyoming Women's Legal Aid Society, working from a small office in Cheyenne to coordinate the network of safe houses and legal advocates that had grown from their mountain cabin operation. Sarah Mitchell became her deputy, using her organizational skills and personal experience to help other young women find their way to safety and independence. White Feather continued his work as a guide and furniture maker, but he also became an advocate for Native American rights, using his position as Mary's husband to bring attention to the injustices faced by his mother's people. Together, they represented a new kind of Western partnership, one based on equality, mutual respect, and shared purpose. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the dock of their mountain lake watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mary reflected on how far they'd traveled from that terrible night when she'd been buried alive in the Wyoming desert. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked White Feather. "Saving me, I mean. Your life would have been so much simpler if you'd just ridden away." White Feather took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "My life would have been empty," he said. "You didn't just survive that night, Mary. You taught me how to live." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mary thought about all the women who were sleeping safely that night because of the changes they'd helped bring about. Some were in their own homes, protected by new laws that recognized their humanity. Others were in safe houses, beginning the long journey toward independence and healing. Still others were in courtrooms, fighting for custody of their children or seeking divorce from abusive husbands. The woman who had once been buried alive had become a force for resurrection, not just her own, but for countless others who had been written off as dead by a society that refused to see their worth. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, the knowledge that their love story had become something larger than themselves, a catalyst for change that would ripple through generations to come. The seeds of freedom they'd planted in the Wyoming Territory would grow and spread, carried by the wind to other states and territories until the day when no woman would ever again have to choose between living death and actual death. It was a legacy worthy of the love that had begun it, and a promise that the future would be brighter than the past had ever been.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.